Hey guys, welcome to my Fastify crash course. So Fastify is, as you can see on the website here, it's a fast and low overhead web framework for Node.js. So it's comparable to Express, and it's very similar in that it's very minimalistic, but there are some advantages that I really like about Fastify. One is the complete ecosystem of plugins that are offered. So basically, if you want, let's say JSON Web Tokens, there's a Fastify JWT plugin. If you want to use MongoDB as your database, there's a MongoDB plugin. Next.js, Redis, Swagger, which we're actually going to be using for our documentation for our API. So there's just a ton of stuff here. You also have community plugins, and I really like that. When you use Express, and in no way am I saying Fastify is better than Express or vice versa, but when you use Express, you usually have just a whole bunch of different types of modules that you're using. I really like the organization of Fastify. Another advantage is speed, and obviously that's implied in the name. And this article here, this is actually from 2019, so it is a bit old, but he did some benchmarking and shows you the results of Express versus Fastify with different endpoints here. And the conclusion was that Fastify was around 20% faster than Express in almost every request. So that is another, pro to using Fastify is the speed and efficiency of it. So we're just going to kind of dive in. We're going to build a CRUD API. I'm going to show you the very basic way to create routes and fetch some data. We're just going to use a file for data for now. And then we'll go ahead and build some controllers. I'll show you how we can add different options for our routes for different responses, and just show you some of the benefits of Fastify. So I'm going to go ahead and open up VS Code, and I just have an empty folder called Fastify API. Now I'm using an extension called REST client, and we're going to be using this to make requests to different endpoints of our API. Now, if you want to use Postman or something different, you can, but this is what I'll be using, and we won't have to leave Visual Studio Code in order to make requests. So first thing we'll do is let's open up a terminal. I'm going to use my integrated terminal here and run npm init-y, which will just create a package.json file. Now, as far as dependencies, we want to install Fastify. So npm install Fastify or yarn, whatever you want to use. And we also want a plugin we're going to be using called fastify-swagger, which will give us a really nice open API documentation for our API. And then I'm also using a module called UUID to generate random IDs. So we're going to install those. And then as far as dev dependencies, I'm just going to install nodemon. So npm install -d nodemon. And that'll make it so, it'll watch the server and we don't have to keep restarting it after every change. And then in the scripts here, I'm just going to add just a basic start script that'll run node and then our main file, which I'm going to call server.js, so just node server. And then let's go ahead and create another one here that's going to run nodemon, and that's going to be our dev script. So npm run dev. Okay, and we'll just change this main to server.js. Now let's close that up and let's create a new file called server.js. And we're going to go ahead and bring in Fastify here. So we want to require it. Now this variable here is what we're going to use to create all of our routes and stuff. If you want to call this app or something different, you can do that. I'm going to keep it as Fastify just because that's how it is in the docs. And then here we can add a set of parentheses and then an object with some options, and we're just going to set logger to true, which will just give us some extra information down in the console. Now to start up our server, we can call fastify.listen, similar to app.listen with Express. It does return a promise, so we are going to create a function here called start, and make sure we make this asynchronous. And then in here, we'll have a try catch. And inside the try, let's await on fastify.listen, and then a port, which I'm going to create a variable up here. So call this port, and I'm going to use port 5000, but feel free to use whatever you'd like. And then down here in the catch, we'll say fastify, and then there's a log. We can do log.error and pass in that error if there is one. And then we just want to exit the process with failures, so process.exit, and pass in a 1 here. And then we just simply want to start the server. So we'll save that, and I should be able to now do npm run dev. Okay, and you'll see this stuff down here, server listening on port, on the URL on the port, the host name, and that's because of this logger true. If you set that to false, it won't show this stuff here. So to create a route, let's just go ahead and do that. We want to say fastify dot and then whatever the method. Well, there's actually a couple ways we can do it. We can do dot route and we can pass in some options, but the shorthand is to just use the method. So let's say get / items. And then we have a handler. So this is, again, very similar to Express. So this is going to be request and then reply. So reply is kind of this is the convention for this. But of course you could call it, res or response. And then in here, all I'm going to do for now is take that reply object and I'm going to call .send, and I'll pass in just an object with, let's say, I don't know, test and hello. Okay, so creating a route is as simple as that. Now to test this route, I'm going to be using my REST client that I have installed for VS Code, but again, you can use Postman, or in this case, you could even use your browser. But to use the REST client, we just create a file with an HTTP extension. So I'm going to call this test.http. And in here, let's say we want to make a GET request to HTTP localhost 5000/items. And we just want to add HTTP/1.1. Okay, and we can actually separate these. I'm going to move this down a line. And we can separate our requests with the triple number sign, and we can also put a comment in here. So let's just say get all items. And obviously, it's not returning items yet, but that's what this route will do. But let's send the request, and you'll see we get back up here, we get back a 200 response. The content type is JSON, the length, the date, and then we have the actual data that's returned, which is just this test hello. Okay, so now we can test all of our routes with this file here. Now, I don't want to actually put, well, you know what? We'll just keep it like this for now. We'll do it in this file, but we're going to move this to a separate routes file in a few minutes. As far as data, I'm just going to use a file, a JavaScript file. So I'm going to create items.js, okay, capital I. items.js, and this is basically going to be our data. We're not using a database in this case, although I may add another video where we can use either Postgres or Mongo or something like that with the Fastify plugin, and you guys can let me know if you want to do that. So here, let's just create an array, call this items, and we'll just have an object with an ID, with a string, and then a name. So we'll say item 1. And I'm just going to copy this down. We'll have 3 different items here. This will be 2 with the ID of 2, and this will be 3, 3. And then let's just do module.export items. All right, so that's our data. So I'm going to bring this into this file by just saying const items and set that to require. And we want to require /items. Okay, and then down here, I want to return those items. So let's get rid of this object and just return items or send items. So now if I go back to my test HTTP, we're going to go ahead and get those items back. All right, now let's create one more route in here, and then we'll move it to a separate file. I want to create a route that just gets a single item. So what we can do is grab this, paste that in there. I'll just close that sidebar up for now. So this I want to get a single item. So it'll be items / and then a param of ID. Now we can get that ID with request, so this request object, and then .params, which is an object that has all the params. So I'm going to use destructuring here to pull out the ID from request.params. And then obviously we're not working with a database. We don't have any kind of ORM like Mongoose or something like that. So we just kind of have to do this by hand, just with JavaScript. So let's use find. We'll say const item, and we'll set it to items, and we'll just use .find, and that takes in an arrow function. So for each item, then we want to get where the item.id is equal to the ID of the param, and then we'll just return that. Okay, so let's go ahead and save that. I'm going to just make this side a little smaller here, and then we can make a request to this items/ID. So I'm going to copy this whole thing right here, and we'll say get single item. Oops. And this will be items/ and we'll get the first one, so item/1, and then let's send, and we should see the first item. If I go 2, then we can see the second, but I'll just keep that at 1. Okay, so we know that's working. Now, as you can imagine, this can get quite messy if we leave this in server.js. So what we'll do is create a separate folder here called routes, and inside routes we'll create items.js. So these will be all of our items routes. Now, with Fastify and using a separate file for routes, we can actually register our routes as a plugin. So the way that we can do that is by using a function. So we're going to say function, and this is going to take in, actually let's call this item routes, and this is going to take in 3 things. It takes in Fastify, options, and then a callback called done. And you just want to make sure at the end of all this you call done, and then you can put your routes in here. So we'll go ahead and grab the 2 routes we created. So we'll take these and we'll cut those out, and we'll put those right in here. And we also want the data, so this doesn't need to be here anymore. We'll take that, we'll put that in our routes file above the function. And since we're down a level, it's going to be /items. Okay, and then we just want to make sure that we export item routes. So down here at the bottom, module.exports item routes. Okay, now since we wrap this in this function like this, we should be able to just register, just like we would when we use a plugin. We register it with fastify.register, and then in here we want to require .routes/items. Okay, so just doing that, if we save and we go back to our HTTP file and I send, it should still work the same way. So we can get all of them, we can get a single item. Now, another thing that we can do is validation with certain schemas for what we want to return from these routes. All right, let me just put a comment in here. So this get, we'll say get all items, and this will get single items. And this is going to get all cleaned up down here. So any logic we have in these handlers are actually going to go in controllers in a little bit. But I just want to show you how we can create options for these. So up here above the item routes function, let's say options for get all items. So basically we can format what is to be returned or responded with from each of these routes. So I'm going to create an object here. I'm going to call it get items, so plural, ops for options. I mean, you can call it what you want, but we're going to call it that. And then in here we can add a schema, so a schema object, and we can actually format for each response, which in this case is going to be a 200 response, because reply.send, as long as nothing goes wrong, that's going to be a 200. So I'm going to say for a 200 response for this particular route, we're going to want this to be an array in this case, because we're getting multiple items. So let's say type and set that to array. And then for the, we want to say for the items, we want that to be a type of an object, and then we can specify the properties that are to be returned. So in our case we have what, an ID and a name. So let's say ID, and we can actually type this. So I'm going to say type string, and then we'll copy that down, and we also have a name, which is also going to be a string. So let's say name. Okay, so we're kind of just formatting how the schema is for the response for this. Now this get items ops, all we have to do to use this in one of our routes is put it as a second argument. So this is the route to get all items. I'm going to paste that in right here as a second argument. So it's the endpoint, the options, and then the handler. So I'm going to save that, and this should still work just the same. It gets, fetches all 3 items. But if I go up here, so this is our schema right here. If I were to comment out, let's say the ID, and I make that request again, notice how it's not giving me the ID. Even though I returned it in my code, it's not going to allow that ID to be shown. Okay, because all I have in my properties here is the name. Also, if I were to change this type to an integer, and I make the request, now it does give me the ID, but it's no longer a string, it's an integer. So it'll actually coerce it into that type. But I want that to be a string, so now when I send, it's a string. So I think that this is a really great feature of Fastify, is the validation and the schema. Now we want to create options for all of our routes, so I'm going to copy. Actually, I'm not going to copy it because it's going to be a bit different, because this route here returns not an array but an object. So let's go down here and let's say const, and we'll call it get item singular ops. And let's say for this, so we want our schema. So schema, and then the response. Well, we want to say, for response 200. Then we want not an array like we did here, but just the object. So I can actually copy this. Items, so type object, so the type and the properties. If you have an array, then you have an additional items, because then you need to say, well, what is in that array? But in this case, it's just an object, so it's going to be a type object with this same thing. All right, and then we'll add this down here to this route. So this will be get item ops. Okay, and that should still work. It gets me item 1. If I were to comment out here, let's comment out name this time. So if I make that request again, it only gives me the ID because that's all I have in my schema. All right, now you'll notice that this type object and properties is the same as this type object and properties. It's just this one is inside of an array, and we're going to be using this in other routes as well. So what we can do is create up here, let's say item schema, and let's say const uppercase I item, and we're going to set that equal to this type object and then our properties. It'll be an object with those in there. So now instead of repeating ourselves, this type array items, we can just replace this with item. And then down here where we have the type and properties, we can just replace this with item. All right, and that should work the same way. So that will get us all of our items. This will get us a single item. Okay, so just cleans it up a little bit. Now, before we move on to being able to add an item, delete, and update, I want to clean this up a little more and create controller functions. So basically, with these options, in addition to the schema, we can also add the handler here. Right now, the handler is down here, right? It's this function. So what we can do is just grab. We want to keep that last parenthesis, but I'm going to grab this and just cut it, so that all we have in here is the endpoint and the options. And let's go up to get items options. Right under the schema, we can add the handler and set that to a function and just paste that in. And we just want to get rid of the arrow here. All right, so if I save that, that should still work the same way. It gives me all of the items, except now the handler is up here in the options instead of putting it here, which cleans this up a bit. And we can do the same thing here where I take, let's see, from here to here, cut that out, and then in this get item options, go under the schema handler and set that to function, and then just get rid of the arrow. And that should still work if we fetch the single item. All right, so we're just cleaning this up a bit before we add more routes. And like I said, the final thing I want to do to kind of clean this up is create controller methods. So I'm actually going to create a new folder here called controllers. And in here we'll create items.js, or you can call it item controller, whatever you'd like. So for this is where we're actually going to need our data now. So we can grab it from here. We can cut it from the actual route file, put it in here. And then let's create our first function, which is going to be get items. And this is going to take in request and reply. And all we're going to do is same thing we did in the route. We're going to reply.send all of the items. Okay, so that'll do that. Then we'll do const get item, and that's going to take in request and reply. Oops, a fat arrow. And then let's take from the handler for the get the single item, we just want the function body here. And we're going to put that in there. All right, now we just want to export both of these. So module.exports, and we're going to set this to an object with the get items and get item. And then we can go into our routes and we can bring those in. So let's say const, we want to bring in get items and get item. And that's going to be from where are we? / controllers / items. And then we can just simply replace this function here. So this is to get all items. So we want to replace that with get items from our controller. And then this one here, this function, we're going to replace that with get item for the single item. So now this is way cleaner than it was before. And let's just test it out. So we can get all of our items and we can get a single item. Okay, so now we have basically the structure of everything. Before we move on to create the rest of our routes, I want to implement the Fastify Swagger plugin, which will give us some really nice documentation for all of our routes. So to do that, we're going to go to server.js, make sure that you installed Fastify Swagger. You can see we have it right here. So we want to register this because it is a plugin. Whenever you install a plugin, you're going to register it, much like we did our routes. So let's say Fastify register, and we want to then pass in require. We want to require Fastify Swagger, and we want to add on to this a second argument of options. And the first thing we want is expose route, which we're going to set to true, which will enable the documentation route. And then for the route prefix, we're going to set that to / let's do /docs. You can make this whatever you like. And then we can add Swagger, and in here an info object with a title. And if you look at the docs, you'll see all the different options, but we're just going to say Fastify API. Okay, so we registered Fastify Swagger and we added some of these options, and it should just work. So if we go to the browser now and we go to HTTP localhost port 5000/docs, you're going to see your Swagger documentation, which is really nice. It's nicely laid out, and you can see our two routes. You can even try it out. So if we say try it out and execute, it gives us back the request URL, the code, the body, the response headers. So really, really cool. And each route that we add will just automatically, be added to this documentation here. All right, so let's continue on with our API. So we have two routes right now, right? We have get all items, get single items. So let's go ahead and do add item. So we're going to say fastify dot post, because this is going to be a post request, to /items, and then we're going to have post, let's say post item, post item ops, which doesn't exist yet. So we're going to go up here and add the options for that. So I'm going to copy, let's see, we'll just copy this here and we'll paste that in, and let's change this to post item ops. And as far as what we want to return from this is going to be just an item, just like this, but I do want to change the response to a 201. And what we're doing here is just saying if it's a 201, then it's going to be an item. We're going to set the 201 in our handler, which I'm going to create now. So we'll call this add item in our controller. All right, and we have to bring that in. I know we didn't create it yet, but we'll go up here and bring it in, add item. It's going to give us an error down here because that doesn't exist. So let's go to our controller here, and let's put this below get item. So we want to do const add item and request reply, and let's see. So in order to do this, we're going to have to get data from the body. Basically, when we make our request, I want to send a name. All we have is an ID and a name. The ID will generate that automatically with that UUID module we installed. So first thing, let's get the name from the body. So just like with Express, you have request.body and then .name or whatever. So I'm going to actually just destructure and take the name from request.body. That'll give us whatever name is sent. And then let's construct the item, which consists of an ID. Now for the ID, I'm going to use the UUID module that I installed earlier. So up here, let's say const, and we're going to take, let's say require, and it's called UUID. And then we want to, from that, there's different versions. We're using version 4, and we're going to rename that as UUID v4. So all we have to do now is call a function called this, and that will create a unique ID for us. So down here, oops, thought I copied it, but down here we're just going to call UUID version 4, and then the name is going to just be the name we took from the body. All right, so that will construct the item. Now I'm going to add it to the items in our data, or I should say in our state, basically, by taking items and setting it to an array, spreading across the current items, but then adding on the new item we just created. And then finally, to respond, we're going to say reply, but I want it to be a 201, so we can just do .code, and then the status code, which is 201, and then .send, and we want to send that item. Okay, so now let's go over to our test, and we'll just copy this. Let's say this is going to add an item, and it's going to be a post request to just /items. All right, so let's go ahead and actually, what's going on here? I don't think I exported it from the controller. No, I didn't. So add item. All right, good. So now let's try to run that post request. And cannot destructure name as it is null. All right, so I didn't actually send name. So we want to add here a content type of application/JSON, and then we just want to add an object with JSON object with name, and let's call this new item. Okay, and then we'll go ahead and send assignment to constant variable. Let's see, I think in my data I used const, whereas items, no, I used let there. I think I used in the controller, yeah, right here. So you want to make sure that's let. All right, let's try that again. Send. All right, so what we get back is our new item. The name is whatever we pass in here, and then the ID was generated with UUID. And if I go up here to get all items, you'll see it's added there. Now it's not going to stay there. If I go over to the routes file here and I save it, it's going to restart the server, and then that's cleared from memory. So now if I get my items, it'll just be the initial 3 in the state. All right, so keep that in mind. We're not persisting the data anywhere, but we can still make our requests, and you can see how it works. So that is to add an item. Now, one more thing I want to do is in the routes file, in addition to, let's see, we want to go to our post item options. In addition to formatting the response, we can also add required fields to the data. Like right now, if I make my post request without the name, if I do that and send the request, it still creates it and just gives it an ID. I don't want that. I want it to have the name. So in our routes, or I should say in the option here, post item options, let me just close that sidebar up. We can, in addition to response in the schema, we can also add an object for body. Make sure you put a comma here. And for this, let's say this is going to be type of object that we send in the body. And then we can add required, which is an array of required fields. So we want to add name. And then we can also add properties. And we can say for the properties, we just have a name, and that will be type of string. All right, so now if I go back to my test here and I try to send this without a name, I get back an object with a status code of 400, a bad request, and it says body should have required property name. So you can have these required fields for your body. All right, so now that that's done, let's do the delete. So I'm going to add another route down here. Actually, I'll just copy this. So let's say delete item, and this is going to be a delete request. So delete, and we do need to pass in the ID here. So let's say item / the ID, and we'll call this for the options delete item ops. And then let's go up here, and as far as what we're getting back from the delete, it's going to be a message that just says it's deleted. So what I'll do is I guess I'll just copy, doesn't really matter, I'll copy this, and we'll go under the post item options, and this is going to be delete item options. And we'll say on a 200 response, I'm not going to use item here. I'm going to use just an object, and we're going to say the type is going to be an object, and then properties, we're just going to have a message on this. So properties, let's say message, which is going to be the type of a string. Okay, and then the handler is going to be delete item, which we haven't created yet, but we'll set it, and then we'll bring it in up here. So delete item. And then in our controller, let's create our delete item. So const delete item request reply. And before I forget, I'm just going to add it down here, delete item. All right, now as far as deleting it, I mean, we're just going to use filter. So first of all, we need to get the ID, which is on request.params, right? So let's say const, we'll destructure the ID from request.params. So we have the ID. Now I'm going to just set items, which is basically our state. We're going to set it to items.filter, and then we're going to pass in our arrow function and say for each item, we want a filter where item.id is not equal to the ID from the params. So basically it'll just take it out, and then we'll reply dot send, and I'm going to just send a message. And actually let's use backticks here so we can say item ID has been removed. All right, so we'll save that, and let's go over here and let's create, I'll just copy this, create our delete requests. So we'll change this to delete item, and let's change the method here to delete. And let's delete, let's do, we'll do 3. All right, so let's try that out. If we go ahead and click that, we get item 3 has been removed. And if I go up here to get all items, we should see just 1 and 2. And again, that's not persisting, it's just in memory. All right, so that's our delete. Now I want to be able to update as well. So let's go to our routes and let's add that. So I'm just going to copy this and we'll say update item fastify. This is going to be put items ID, and then let's call this update item options, which we need to create up here, which is pretty much the same as like the get single, because it's just going to return an object, an item object. So I can just copy get item ops, and we'll go down here at the bottom right above the function, and let's call this update item options. It's going to be a 200 with the item, and then the handler is going to be called update item, which we have to bring in from our controller and create. So let's say update item, go into our controller, and I'll just copy the delete here, and let's change that to update item. And before I forget, we'll go ahead and bring that here. And then as far as what we want to do here for update, we do want to get the ID from the params. We also want to get, let's just get rid of this. We also want to get the, actually no, we'll keep that there. Well, we'll just keep that there for now. But let's get the name from the body, because that's really the only thing we can update, right? Unless you add other fields. So let's get that from request.body. Now, there's a few ways we can do this. What I'm going to do is take our items, and I'm going to set it to items.map, so we can loop through the items and basically return whatever we want from it. And I want to return the entire array with the updated item. So let's say for each item, we want to have a condition where we test and see if the item ID is equal to the ID from the param. If so, we're going to return the ID with the new name from the body. Else, it's just going to return the item as is. Okay, just how, the default. And then down here, we want to return just that single item, so we can use .find. So instead of .filter, let's do .find. And this is just all regular JavaScript. This has nothing to do with Fastify. But basically, I want to say where the item ID is equal to the ID. And then as far as what we want to return or send is just the single item. And that should do it. So let's create our last request here. I'm going to copy the add item, the post, because we want to be able, to update the name. So down here, let's paste that in, and let's say update item, and we want this to be a put request to items / and we'll do 2 for the update, and we'll change the name to updated item, like that. All right, so now if I send my request, it's going to give us back a 200 response with the new updated item name. And if I were to get all my items, you'll see the second one has the name of updated item. So we now have a full CRUD API, and we have our options inside of our routes with a little bit of validation with some schemas or a schema, and we have our Swagger documentation, which we can actually take a quick look at. So if I reload this, it should show all of our different routes. We have our post, our 2 gets, our put, and our delete. All right, so this is really just scratching the surface of Fastify. There's so much more you can do with this, and there's a ton of different plugins to do different things, which I'd really like to get into. So let me know if you guys like this and you want me to continue on and maybe do some authentication, deal with the database. There's plugins for cores and just a whole bunch of stuff. So that's it, guys. I hope you found this useful, and I will see you next time.